Hello, everybody. This is Ryan Clancy, Chief Strategist for No Labels, here with our first post-election edition of No Labels Talks. And with us, we have our political panel, which we've assembled at several different points over the last couple months to give us a sense of where this race is headed. We got Dritan Nesho from the Harris polling firm, and Chris McNulty from Chris. You know what? I'm having a brain fart. Where do you work?
Causeway Solutions.
Chris McNulty, data guru from Causeway Solutions. So look, a lot to get through. And of course, not just at the presidential level. Of course, we know why that got all the attention, but plenty of notable developments in Senate and House races, and a lot of vote counting still happening, particularly in House races. But look, I want to start with the headline news. As all of you know by now, former President Trump won in pretty convincing fashion. I believe it is now up to around 5 million is the popular vote lead he's got. And Dritan, is he over 300 electoral votes yet?
He's not over yet, but he's just shy of that. And
Okay.
Once we have final numbers from Arizona and Nevada, either of those states will put him over that.
So let me start here, Dritan. Why don't you just, at the very highest level, what just happened on Tuesday?
Sure. Well, I would say that the biggest change was a change in turnout for Democrats. And what I mean by that is that whereas President Biden in 2020 received over 80 million votes, only about 67 to 68 million of those votes turned out for Vice President Harris. That's a significant difference. And I would say that not only the turnout for the Democrats wasn't there, but as we've now learned from the exit polls and from the vote count, Trump actually increased his performance across the board from what we saw in 2020. And whenever you have a gap that is that big, 13 million voters who didn't show up, and Trump, even though his vote tally is less than what it was in 2020, gained in many key areas, you have to ask the question, where did that come from, right? What changed? What shifted? And why didn't the Democratic coalition in 2020 stay intact? And part of the lesson from the exit polls and from the data is that Vice President Harris was not able to get a lot of independent voters, a lot of voters in the center to come out and vote for her. There was a lack of enthusiasm there. And it looks like she wasn't speaking to these voters on the key issues that mattered the most to them. First and foremost, inflation and the cost of living and the economy, but certainly general competency with the key issues of the day that also include immigration, that also include crime, and so on and so forth. So this is a big lesson coming out of this election. And there's obviously shifts among several key groups, men, Latino voters, and so on and so forth, which I can comment on in just a second, that are part of that gap or help explain that big gap in turnout, why Harris is, 13 million votes short from where Biden was in 2020.
Chris, there's a lot to pick from to answer the question, what was surprising in terms of the data you're looking at. But let me ask you that. As you, over the course of the last couple of days, dug into the exit polling, the actual polling from the states, what is it that shocked you the most about what you were seeing?
New voters. New voters have historically, and I go back 20, 30 years in the business and Republican politics, and as a Republican operative, if you saw the amount of new voters that we saw nationally here, you'd go, oh boy, that's trouble, because new voters never vote for Republicans. it broke almost 50-50. And in fact, Trump won new voting males. And by new voters, I mean people are voting for the first time. Anywhere, probably registered or voted for the first time. Typically, that's been the kind of domain of it's a young Democrat voter coming out for the first time, registering for the first time. They were first time voters, but there was about a 50-50 break among new voters voting for Trump. That was one of the first signs, I think, that so boy, this is a different makeup of the electorate, or they're voting differently at the very least.
Yeah. What about Dritan independence? One of the things there's a lot of commentary around is independence in this election actually outpaced Democrats and Republicans, independents, unaffiliated, just people not affiliated with either party. Which way did they tend to break if you look across that voting group?
Sure. Well, I'll use a slightly different label, moderates, right, of which there's a very large overlap with the independent voting group.
Yeah.
And simply put, in 2020, President Biden won this group by 30 points, whereas Vice President Harris won this group by about 15 points. That is a significant shift. And again, these independents, these moderate voters, either they didn't show up to vote for the Democratic candidate, which is where the inclination is, or as I just mentioned, they flipped to Trump. And Trump made significant gains and significant inroads with them. Also, to Chris's point, I want to underscore the point about voters 30 years old and under. Vice President Harris won this group by about 8 points, but in 2020, President Biden won them by over 21 points. So again, you see shifts across the board on many key demographics, and this is why Trump is going to win the popular vote by a few million votes. And frankly, this is why Trump is winning all of the swing states. And Vice President Harris, when it's all said and done, is unlikely to carry any of these swing states. In 2020, if people remember, President Biden actually won 6 out of 7 of the swing states, the battleground states, Arizona, Nevada, Georgia, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, which are the key states that determine modern presidential elections. So lots to learn there, lots of lessons, especially amongst these younger voters and amongst these moderate voters.
One thing, though, that happened once again in this election, similar to what happened in 2020 and 2016, is once again, it did seem like the polling seemed to understate former President Trump's support as we went into election day and you looked at the various polling. There were several polling showing Vice President Harris slightly ahead. There were some ties. There were a few that showed, former President Trump with a little bit of a lead. There really wasn't much to suggest he was going to win by 4 points and 5 million votes in the popular vote. So again, Chris, let me start with you. Is there still this phenomenon, which people have been talking about, of a secret Trump vote out there that either doesn't tell pollsters what they really think, or they don't pick up the phone when the pollsters call?
It agrees to it agrees to a point. It exists to a point. I will take a different take on it though, and almost kind of counter your premise. There wasn't out there. It depends on what people want to see in the polls or look at in the polling as to whether or not there were signs. The biggest, I think, 2 things occurred here that people didn't pay enough attention to. And Dritan will probably correct me on the exact numbers, but when Biden ran in 2020, the national generic ballot was probably D+4, D+3, D+5, in that ballpark. The national generic ballot, if you were watching it over the last 2 months in particular, has tracked to basically tied 0. That was a giant warning sign that it hasn't been there. It just hasn't been there. More like in my term in politics, number one. Number two, the people and other stuff like Pew identifying as Republicans versus identifying with Democrats. The Democrat identification had gone way down. Republicans actually gained a few points, which hasn't happened in a while either. So put those two factors out there, number one. Number two, know that even when you take a poll and it says it's tied, like all of them did, or many of them did, there's that 3-point kind of margin of error. Well, that means you could be 3 points better than what the tie tells you. And that's essentially what you got. And I looked at these things and go, well, national generic ballot's been stratospheric for Republicans right now compared to history. Identification with the party of Democrats is lower than it's ever been. That's been out there for a while. And you have a tied ballot, tied in a lot of these polls, with a 3-point margin of error. Guess what?
Yeah.
You could be at 3 points. Dritan, I'll defer to the actual pollster.
No,
What do you think?
Chris is absolutely right, right? The quote unquote misses in the polling, they were all within that 3 points margin of error here and there. And there was a clear phenomenon of Trump picking up steam over the course of the last 2 weeks heading into the election that we saw in our polling. In fact, our polling shifted from Harris being up +4 3 weeks before the election to the day before the election when we released or we conducted our final poll, they were tied with likely voters. So that's one thing. The other thing is that Trump closed very strong, and the Republican political machine is known for turning out voters the day of the election. And that made a very big difference because the Republicans were able to turn out their voters and largely keep their baseline from 2020, a little bit less, but they preserved it, whereas the Democratic turnout was not there. So it's not inconceivable to say that Harris lost this election that last 3 weeks, where the momentum that she had as a new candidate who could bring together the Democratic coalition fizzled. And even, center-left publications like Axios labeled her as the question mark candidate. I mean, in retrospect, whoever thought that we should replace the incumbent president who was selected via a primary 90 days out from the election and place a candidate who doesn't have answers to the tough questions facing the country, and that candidate would win, I think hindsight is 2020 on that question, but there's a reason why American elections last a year or more, and the primary processes are so brutal, is so that voters know where the candidates stand on the key issues that are affecting them. And this was a major liability for Harris that last 2 weeks. And you could say that once her momentum fizzled, people then snapped back into the issue concerns that they had, economic concerns, the perception that the country was not going in the right direction. And that plays squarely into Trump's hand and into his vote. He was always viewed as the more competent candidate when it came to the key issues. She was always viewed as the candidate that had the better temperament to become president. Well, guess what? American voters, they liked the Marlboro men, and they selected the Marlboro men, right? Competent, brawny, rambunctious, but someone that they thought was the devil that they knew on a whole array of difficult and challenging issues facing the country versus a candidate that frankly they felt was hollow on these core issues.
Dritan, what about, look, if you hear Democrats who, a lot of them are working through why this happened, how this happened. And one of the explanations you saw a lot of people reaching for yesterday is Vice President Harris's race and gender. And that was an undercurrent here that explains why she didn't perform well. I want to just ask you about the polling itself. Is there anything in the polling that you're seeing to suggest that's part of this?
I think that that's the wrong early conclusion and probably the wrong conclusion, period, because the Democratic Party, a party of whom I am a member, even though I'm more conservative and more to the center, needs to reckon with the fact that it lost Latinos and especially Latino men, right? I mean, Donald Trump in 2024 outperformed George W. Bush in 2004, and even Reagan with Hispanic voters and with Latino voters, carrying 46% of these voters. And key amongst them are Latino men. I mean, Harris did a little bit better with Latino women, but in general, men were a problem. And it wasn't for Latinos only, it was also for Black male voters, right? And Trump performed 230% better than he did last time around. He won about 23% of the Black male vote, maybe even more. And so the Democratic Party, you know, which seems to have been a little bit obsessed over the last two cycles, calling men toxic and toxic masculinity and all of these terms being thrown around, well, maybe they didn't land so well with male voters. And that is a point of reckoning. And it's not just about white males, it's about Black males and Hispanic males as well. It cuts across these race and gender distinctions. And so I think that is an overly simplistic conclusion. We have to look at a whole array of groups, including, by the way, labor unions and male voters who identified as being members of labor unions. She underperformed there as well. Harris underperformed with the working class. As it stands today, the Republican Party is the party of the working class. It's not anymore the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party is the party of the professional class. And certainly Harris didn't help in the last 2 weeks of the election by focusing on celebrity endorsements rather than focusing on going out there on the stump and connecting with the voters in the way that Trump did. So I would beware of simplistic conclusions, overly simplistic conclusions. This cuts across gender and race differences.
Well, speaking about things to be wary of, Chris, there's been a lot of commentary around this being a realignment election in a lot of ways, that Donald Trump put together a coalition, the likes of which no Republican has put together in the modern era, and that resulted in him winning the popular vote, winning the Senate. Certainly he had coattails there, and it looks like Republicans will probably take the House. One interesting point you have made, and this would be a cautionary tale for President Trump as he comes in, is you've talked about how some of this voting coalition he put together is rented. They're not his voters. Talk about that.
Yeah, so, and it really picks up on a point that Dritan made earlier. There was a lot of swing voters that were undecided until the last, Dritan said 2-3 weeks. I had the most amount of data in North Carolina where we were tracking it week to week, and I'd say about 4 weeks is when I started to see the turn. And the point is that is this the largest victory in quite a while? Yes, certainly for a Republican, without question. Having said that, it is an opportunity, I would argue, for the Trump administration to have a durable coalition mandate. But there is a group of voters in the middle that I would argue are not necessarily in love with Donald Trump. They're not necessarily unable or unavailable to the Democratic Party. But because Trump represented, in their case, the devil that is known, and perhaps in their eyes, somebody more than for solutions to their problems, and because Harris didn't articulate solutions, I would argue, to their problems, they voted for Trump, and they gave him this very large vote, and it looks like a mandate. However, they are rented; they aren't owned by Trump. So what happens over the next 2 months, 6 months, year is going to determine kind of where those folks end up lying. There is an opportunity for Trump to speak to them for sure. I would say though that these are voters. They are not necessarily today a locked in part of the Democrat or the Republican coalition at all. They are out there and they are seeking. Ryan, we talked about it earlier. They are seeking solutions and results, and they are going to, I would argue, push back on the bickering and stalemate stuff you see in DC and not be happy. They could be quite unhappy very soon again if they don't see some results.
Well, and Dritan, I want to ask you about that, and then we'll pick up some questions that are starting to pick up in the queue here. Is about what makes these voters Chris is talking about different? Because look, we all know that there is a contingent of Trump's base for whom his outrageous behavior, the things he does that drives liberals crazy, that's a feature, not a glitch. They like that performative aspect of when he gives them. There are other voters, though, that's not why they voted for him. They are very fixated on results, on issues they care about. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Sure. I mean, look, simply put, and to piggyback off of what Chris said, which I wholeheartedly agree, I do think that this is a rented coalition that Trump was able to pull together. The common sense voters, right, that we have focused on at No Labels and were part and parcel of our campaign, those voters, while they still broke Democratic in significantly smaller margins than what was required to carry the Democrats through. And that in and of itself is a strong signal that needs to be considered carefully by the Democratic Party. If you look at the arc of American politics, the election of Barack Obama and the Obama era in American politics, of which you could say Biden was part of or was the long tail of, right, was a reaction and a repudiation to the neoconservatism that came with George W. Bush and the excesses of that neoconservatism. In a similar fashion, Trump's two elections are a repudiation of the excesses of wokeism that came as part of the Obama cycle in American politics. So here's what we know for a fact 25 years into this process. Neoconservatism will not work in American politics. The excess wokeism that became the main pillar of the Democratic Party under the Biden-Harris administration, at least on the cultural side of things, will not work in American politics. And what we know will work in American politics are smart, tangible, proactive solutions to the problems that voters feel that they are facing. And this was the key differentiator in this campaign. This is why, if you notice very closely, Trump's own slogan evolved over the course of the last 6 weeks ahead of the election from Make America Great Again or whatever derivative of that original slogan to Biden and Harris broke it, Trump will fix it. Fix was the operating word of that campaign. And frankly, I'm a professional political strategist, and I don't even know what Harris's slogan was, what her theme, what her promise was to the American people. And so there in and of itself, if you reduce it to the true substance and the true operating dynamic of these two campaigns, is all of the difference that you need to think about and kind of analyze that helps explain the result that we received in the election this week.
Thanks, Dritan. Listen, before we open it up to questions, I do want to give everybody just an update on the great work some of our team pulled together, led by our co-executive director, Margaret White. Everybody was focused on the presidential race, but there's a lot of other races people care about. I want to just give you the latest read of where things stand, both overall and as it relates to a couple of our allies. Then we'll get to questions. Starting here, there are still a lot of House races left to call. In fact, there's still 22 competitive seats in play. If all the remaining races go in the direction where we assume the candidate that is currently leading triumphs in the end, Republicans would end up with a 6-seat House majority. In the Senate, it looks like Pennsylvania was just called for David McCormick over Bob Casey. So that gets the Republicans to 53. Nevada is still close to call, though Jackie Rosen is up there by about a point with 90% of districts reporting. Finally, I just want to let you all know that problem solvers overall did very well in their races. In fact, they notched a record of 35-3. There's also a couple very close races that we've been watching with some members. Some of you have heard on calls. And the news is all pretty good there as well. Don Bacon, the Republican who represents the at-large district in Nebraska, he is leading by 3 with 95% reporting. He's declared victory. AP hasn't called it yet. Similar scenario with Jared Golden up in Maine. He's up by 1, has declared victory. AP hasn't called yet. And then there's 3 other races where our allies are leading. David Valadao in California, Susie Lee in Nevada, Marie Gluskamp-Perez in Washington. All of them are leading with various degrees of the vote in. So overall, pretty good night for the problem solvers and No Labels allies. With that, let me go to some questions. And if you can just say your name and where you're from. Let's start with Greg.
Greg Autry from Hubbard Lake, Michigan. As I watched the election unfold, like we all did, I kept thinking about how right No Labels had it 2 years ago when they read the tea leaves perfectly. And we can slice and dice the demographics all we want and criticize or praise the campaigns all we want on how they did. But the bottom line, I think, and my question is to our panelists is, does this matter? And that is 70% of the Americans were dissatisfied with the direction our country was going. And 70% of them had indicated they didn't want a Trump-Biden or Biden-Harris rematch. And so we go into this when the overriding message being Americans want to change. They didn't see that in Harris. So did this dissatisfaction with the direction our country is headed have an impact on this election?
Chris, what do you think?
100%. I mean, it was I mentioned national generic ballot and some of those other things. If you add on as to how things ultimately broke to Trump, particularly with the middle moving in a larger capacity towards Trump. The other thing I didn't mention is the thing you point out. You unless you're defining a very clear new vision, if you have numbers as bad as it is that 70% of the country believes the country's on the wrong track, that is extraordinarily big mountain for an incumbent party to go get over the top of. So it absolutely mattered. And I want to kick to Dritan, but I would also say that I still to this day believe No Labels had it right. There are in addition to this group that swung late, both Harris and Trump had significant percentage of their electorate, their support from groups that I would call reluctant supporters for Trump and reluctant supporters for Harris that were still looking for other options. They just didn't have it.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, ultimately, the 2 strongest indicators of the future performance of an election is the question on job approval, which Biden had a low job approval, and even Harris, even at her height, never really broke through 50% job approval because she was intrinsically tied to the administration. And then the second one is a question about personal finances, right? Which we know the famous cousin of that question, which is, are you better off now than you were 4 years ago? All the way up until election day, close to 50% of Americans were saying that their finances are getting worse off than they were before. And only about 30% were saying, or even less, that were saying they're better off. With answers like that, as an incumbent, you're in trouble. You're in deep trouble. And the Democratic Party, despite the fact that it again outspent the Republican Party, probably by a factor of 2 to 1 and maybe even more, will know soon enough, because this election, as Bloomberg reports, close to $15 billion were spent up and down all of the different races. Despite being outspent, both Trump and the Republicans have done exceptionally well, and that tells you something.
Thanks, Dritan. Dave, you have a question. Dave, you're on mute.
Dave Walker from Alexandria, Virginia. I'm a political independent. I would respectfully suggest that Vice President Harris was the weakest candidate the Democrats have had in decades. that she was nominated through the least democratic process in history, and that ultimately voters based their vote based on policy rather than personality, because the result would have been different if they based it on personality. My question is, how's the House going to end up? Who's going to control the House? And obviously it's going to be narrow, but who's going to ultimately control the House?
Ryan, we've talked about this. You want to take it?
Yes, it looks, Dave, like, 4, 6, 4, 5, 6, maybe. There's still a couple dozen races out to call. One of the things that I think is really notable, and this is important for everybody.
Ryan, to be clear, Ryan's also saying +4 to +6 for Republicans,
That's right. That's right. For Republicans to have the majority. But, one of the things to be really clear about is you could look at that and say, oh, well, President Trump's going to come in with Senate control and House control, and he's just going to get everything he wants. But for one thing, that Republican coalition is not anything close to monolithic. And so if you look at the right flank of the party, a Marjorie Taylor Greene, and then you look at the center of the party, a Mike Lawler from outside New York, Mike Lawler has got more in common with Josh Gottheimer, a Democrat from Northern New Jersey, than he does Marjorie Taylor Greene. And that describes a lot of the members of that coalition. And so there's a lot of instances where all those Republicans are not going to line up. And that really creates an open for the bipartisanship that No Labels is always trying to advocate for. Dorsey, you have a question.
Well, it's the sharing of information and a question that goes with it, which is I host a weekly Texas No Label Zoom here in Austin, and one of our members is in El Paso. And he shared today that so many of the Hispanics on the border, our southern border, went for Trump. And so he asked some of the some of the workmen that he knows about that. And what they shared was that the Republicans hired a woman, the mother of the girl that was killed by a Venezuelan, migrant. And she went to all the little towns and villages up and down the border and talked about how Biden was letting just all these Venezuelans come across the border, thousands of them, and that how dangerous it was, and about how her daughter was killed and everything. And that had a lot of impact on the number of them voting for Trump. And then he referenced some about how the Puerto Ricans and the Cubans have been sort of put into division against each other. And I'm not hearing anything in the reports. It's all about, well, they're voting because of the economy. But the thing is, this is something, this isn't just some kind of anecdote or a friend of mine said da 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 da. Well, maybe it is a friend of mine, but this is Bob, a member of No Labels. He's lived in El Paso for a long time. He knows these workmen, and that's what was reported. And so, so I guess I'm sharing that information for what it's worth. You can certainly look into it if you choose to. And then the other thing is, I'm not hearing anything about something like that.
So, Dritan, we talked about the Hispanic vote and how it broke for Trump. What do we know about why they vote for Trump? Was it all economic issues mostly, or were there some other factors that drove that?
Well, we know that first and second generation Hispanics, broke for Trump. And part of that is that a lot of the illegal immigration that's coming into the country, it puts pressure in terms of jobs and wages on this group first and foremost, right? And so it's an explainable phenomenon. It's a phenomenon that has been observed before in the past. And obviously, the number of illegal immigrants in the United States during the span of this administration has grown by over 10 million. That's a lot. And so I think that's the simple explanation. There hasn't been any kind of specific polling of these groups, but this is a phenomenon that has been observed over several cycles, that these first generation Hispanics, especially in the border areas, they tend to vote more for the Republicans, more conservative than they tend to vote for Democrats, which is unexpected, right? You would think the opposite, but it's not the case.
Interesting. Thanks, Dritan. Thanks, Dorsey. Art, you have a question.
Thank you to our experts. This is a question for both of them, as well as our resident strategists. Commonly, new presidents overexercise the actual support they have, and they may bulldoze through their proposals, but then they deal with offending the country and seeing the midterms switch at least one house to the other side. Along those lines, what's the best evidence you've seen in the voting results, as well as your analysis of how one argues that Donald Trump has no mandate?
Well, I'll start, and then I'm happy to pass on to Chris and Dritan. I would not argue he does not have a mandate. He does have a mandate. He just won a 5 million vote majority, along with the House and Senate majority. What I would argue is he may not have a majority for what the far right base of his party wants, which is to say, people voted. If you look at the issues they cared about most, it was the price of things and it was immigration. And so, to the extent Trump makes progress on solving those problems, then he's going to make those voters happy, and he might maintain that support. If he decides to pursue some of the fixations, some of the, call them revenge fantasies that tend to animate his base, I don't think that's going to play well with what Chris refers to as his rented voting demographic that put him over the top. But Chris, what do you think?
No, it's 100% accurate. I agree. He has today a mandate. What he does with it will determine whether or not he can keep that together or not. I will say that the 15-20% of his coalition is waiting. If they go too far right, if it looks personal and it doesn't look like progress, they're out. They want results, and they want results on those basic issues of grocery prices. And just so there's a mandate today, but the durability of that mandate depends on what the administration does with it.
Stamen, you have a question.
Thank you. Thank you, Ryan. It seems to me that if we're looking for simplistic analysis, this election was the triumph of demoralization over demonization, by which I mean that the Democrats, with a not so great Biden record behind for 4 years, and the mess of the process of putting a candidacy together this year, a lot of Democrats just said, "The hell with it. I'm not interested," and demonstrated thereby that those who were terrified or claimed to be terrified of the Trump list to radical right strategies and the Nazism claims and so forth, either weren't sincere about that or didn't care enough about that claim to go to the polls. And so the question that I have is the observation of that by the Democratic Party itself going to increase the magnetic pull back toward the center?
What do you think, Dritan?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, look, as Ryan said, it's really about what Trump does with his mandate, how quickly he loses that mandate if he doesn't give voters the solutions that they're looking for. And many of these solutions are very difficult, right? I mean, they have to do with everything from lowering inflation, which is a challenging prospect, to growing the economy, to also making sure that the federal budget deficit, which is a hidden variable in all of these, doesn't mushroom and doesn't grow too much. And so he's got a challenging 2 years ahead of him. And if he plays to the excesses of his far base, then he'll lose in 2 years, and this coalition will come undone. And if he gives actual solutions, then he'll reaffirm that mandate. But we have to be clear that his mandate in 2024 is stronger than his mandate in 2016. And the reaction to Donald Trump has always been a little bit worse than the phenomenon that they're reacting to himself. Even in 2016, when he didn't have a track record in government, he wasn't as prepared as he is today, given that he's been 4 years within the White House. So all of these calls that we're already hearing about protests, about fighting, about civil disobedience, and some Democratic political figures have made those in the last 48 hours. Don't. That is the surest way to lose. And that is the surest way to make the country lose here, because the voters have spoken. And with the voters spoken, there is at least, a period of 6 months or so where you have to allow a new administration to play its hand and to answer what the voters have given them a mandate for. If they don't, then that's a different story. That's when the reaction has to come. But there's pitfalls on both sides. And if this is going to be a replay of 2016 to 2020, then everyone will lose. The Democrats will lose, the country will lose, and it will be, again, a zero-sum game. The best that we can hope for is to do an introspection as to why we lost as a party, and then move forward in a way that matters to the voters, answering what they want from their elected leaders.
Thanks, Dritan. Got time just for a couple more questions. Fred, over to you.
Ron, what did No Labels learn from this in terms of our place in the process, where America is going, and the need for us and the demand for us, and our really value add to all this?
Well, I mean, Fred, I think the biggest thing is what we're concerned about as we look out over the course of the next year is there's a real risk the dominant forces shaping our politics could be the forces of revenge versus the forces of resistance. When what the public really wants is results. That's where they want the fixation to be. And so that's why, as I was talking about earlier, we know there is some faction of the Republican Party today that feels former President Trump was wronged, all the investigations into him over the course of the last couple of years, and let's respond in kind and do that to the Democrats. And for their part, you already see some Democrats saying, before we even inaugurate the new president, it's full-on resistance all the time. And as Dritan pointed out, if you do either of those things, that is the absolute surefire way to lose support of the people you're trying to win over. Could there be moments where a new administration, this administration, oversteps its bounds, and it is proper to fight back against them? Of course. But if it's just going to be willy-nilly, we're going to just try to resist everything for 4 years. The problem is the public's not waiting for that. The public needs eggs to be cheaper. The public needs the border to be under control. The public knows we've got these countries abroad, Iran, China, Russia, that are just circling, looking to chip away at our influence all around the globe. And so that really speaks to everything No Labels is focused on. And I know a lot of you have heard us talk about our national meeting we're going to have about a month from now. That's the entire focus of that meeting, is organizing those leaders that are not going to be consumed by revenge or resistance, but are instead going to work towards results.
Great. Thank you.
Sure. And finally, Tony, you have a question.
So, Brian, David Brooks today suggests that part of Harris's problem was that the people who didn't vote for her felt the Democratic Party did not respect them. To what degree do you believe that is part of the issue? And if it is, then what does the Democratic Party have to do to regain the trust of these people?
Well, I'm going a little off script. I'm not following polling here as much as my instinct. I think the answer to that is absolutely yes. It's just too many, in too many instances, I think voters looked at a lot of Democrats in the closing weeks of the race, where you had major Democratic figures basically making the argument saying, if you don't vote how we say you should vote, you are a bad, immoral person. I don't know what world they're living in which they think that's a compelling case to voters, that you guilt them into voting how they want. That is a recipe to keep losing over and over again. And so what I'd say coming out of this is there's a nice bedtime story people in the Democratic Party can tell themselves, that the reason we lost is it's because somebody else's fault. It's because there's something wrong with the nation. There's something wrong with the voters. If that's what you want to do, then you can repeat this result for a couple elections now. Or you could turn the mirror back on yourself and say, you know what? Maybe we need better ideas and better candidates, and we need to not be seen as looking down upon voters. Chris, Dritan, I don't know if there are things you're seeing in the polling that suggest that voters perceived Democrats as condescending to them. Is there anything, Dritan, Chris, you're seeing there?
I'll jump in real quick. My quick answer is no, I don't see anything in the polling that speaks specifically to that. What I would say though is that, you know, I come from this perspective as a Republican operative with all, you know, with clarity. But when your problem is younger, white, working class voters, I thought this to myself about Pennsylvania, and you are trotting out, and I'm not making any judgment call here, but a list of celebrities who are multimillionaires like Lady Gaga in the final days. What are you saying to that white working class voter who biggest problem is the cost of the grocery bill every week for their family? I don't know what the message is there. I don't know if that's disrespecting Ryan to get to answer the question, but it's not being in tune with, for sure.
Yeah. We do have time for one final question. Randy.
Dritan was going to say
Yeah.
something.
Oh, Dritan.
Sorry,
go ahead.
I was, for some reason, I was on I was on mute. Look, it's very simple. You can't win a modern election if you don't connect and speak to the working class. I agree wholeheartedly with Chris that that was not done. If you don't connect and you don't speak to male voters, right? Still half of the country. And secondly, if you don't connect and speak to moderates and independents, right? And part of that is the very loaded rhetoric that Democrats also engaged in when it came to Trump, or even cultural issues, right? Do you really think that someone who orders Chick-fil-A is your mortal enemy? No, they're not, right? Like, I mean, we have to move past the excesses of both, you know, deep sides of the spectrum, the far left and the far right. And this is what, you know, no labels so many years ago when we started our initiative for this presidential cycle about 2-3 years ago. And it's really what played out in this election amongst these core groups, moderates and independents, you know, men and several other key voter groups without whom you can't really win the election.
Randy, one final question. Go ahead.
Yeah, real quick, just this question. What role do you think that pollster bias plays in our elections now? You had across the board, everybody saying it's tied when it really wasn't tied. It was a mandate. And then specifically the Iowa poll that came out days before the election saying that here's a Midwestern state that she's going to win by 3, and he blows her away. And how do you explain that? I just curious about pollster bias and your perspective on that.
Yeah,
Yeah, I mean,
Dritan,
I
what's
can-
wrong with your profession? Come on.
Well, look, the Seltzer poll, it was unexplainable, right? And if you look inside the poll, it was also not weighted. Most pollsters calibrate their results to reflect what you know from the census, what is the true view and the true composition of the country. So I would put that as an outlier and as a polling mistake. It obviously happened from someone who has a very big name and a big reputation in the industry, and these types of things happen. I would say that the polling, this was a complex election to read into, and the differences were within those margins of error. The way now the Electoral College breaks is that if you win a state, you win all of those votes, and you paint the map red or you paint the map blue. But by and large, polling still helps. You still have to read it with a critical eye and look at the trends behind the polling. Nevertheless, polling will never explain turnout, right? In modern polling and even more traditional polling has always failed to understand who actually comes out and votes. And that is what made the difference in this election. It's very simple to see. Minus 13 million votes on one side, and the other side, by and large, held their voting baseline from 2020. And so turnout was that X factor.
I want to add, to defend my friend Dritan's profession and my friend
Yours too, Chris.
is that I don't think there's polling bias among 99% of pollsters. What there is presentation bias by the news networks. And you are fed what that network's particular narrative they want. I saw a couple of polls on a couple of the kind of MSNBCs of the world where they cherry pick 1 or 2 points out of there. Like, it shows Kamala Harris up 18 points on somebody with the best temperament to deal with foreign leaders. And that's what's presented out of the whole poll. Well, the whole poll says she's losing. And the whole poll says she's not doing well among Hispanic men. And that's all in the poll. But what is presented in that tidbit, that 2-minute segment that you get on MSNBC, is there's bias among the MSNBCs, not among the data that comes out of 99% of the polls.
Yeah. There you have it. Most pollsters are liars. That's the you guys do good work. Listen, Chris, Dritan, thank you so much again for joining us here right after the election. A lot more coming in. Maybe we'll do this again once we get more of this data in the rearview mirror. But thank you all so much for taking a couple of minutes to share your insights with us, and thank you all for joining us. And we hope we'll see you again on next week's edition of No Labels Talks.